Well, welcome once again to my library and my recording library, I guess. Today, the scene behind me that you see is the green drawing room at Windsor Castle. And I've selected that because some of the things that we're going to be talking about today and actually in the next week and in my other videos for this week are going to be talked about initially in a lot of drawing rooms in Europe. I can't go to some of the ones in France where the salons were held, so we'll have to make do with this. For this lecture, we're going to be looking at the secular creeds, or sometimes called the isms. The isms were and are a group of ideologies, but they're ideologies that are a little bit different from a number of the various theories that we've looked at so far. Many of the theories that we've looked at politically encompass God as part of it. Hobbes is the only one who we've looked at so far who really doesn't talk about God's role in government. And even then, he hints at a lot of Calvinist ideas, the depravity of man sorts of things. But in the Enlightenment, this age of reason, we're going to see a lot more scholars and a lot more thinkers who are not going to espouse a religion of much of anything. And so as a result, to try and fill that, they pursue these creeds, these ideologies that consume them, and they pursue them with a religious-like devotion, a piety that's matched only by the most religious. But they're utterly secular and often have no mention of the divine at all. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this is something that, while it's not about worshiping God in any shape or form, it's going to have a religious-like kind of devotion as part of it. And that's why we call them secular creeds. So here we go. Let's go talk a little about the isms. Today we're going to start into the isms, kind of introduce a few of them, and then we'll move on to some different isms in different videos as we'll go. Now, the first of these political isms, and the one that's going to be dominant in the 19th century, and there are going to be two that are dominant politically, and there are going to be others that will show up and will come in and out, and some that will come later. Now, the most important of them in the 19th century is going to be conservatism. Now, conservatism is going to have a number of different faces and a number of different ideas associated with it. But in the 19th century, the face of conservative thought was, in fact, this gentleman here. This is Clemens von Metternich. The von gives you an idea. He's noble. He's actually usually going to have a prince at the front of his name. Metternich is going to be the Austrian foreign minister. In many ways, kind of the dominant figure of the government of Austria in the early 19th century. Certainly is the figure at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and is going to dominate them through the 19th century, really to about 1850 or so. Another conservative figure of the 19th century, not on the continent, but in Britain, is going to be the Duke of Wellington. Duke of Wellington, famous, of course, for defeating Napoleon at Waterloo, is also going to go into politics after his successful military career has ended, and is going to serve as prime minister. He's going to preside over some reforms as well, and that's something to keep in mind. There were conservatives like Metternich, and Metternich wanted to shove everything back in the bottle after the end of the French Revolution and Napoleon. He wants to get rid of nationalism and concepts of liberty and equality and all of these things, which are, quite frankly, antithetical to the government that he's a part of. The Austrian Empire is not part of this, and the concepts of nationalism are pretty deadly for the Austrian Empire, quite frankly. And so he's a reactionary kind of conservative. Duke of Wellington is more what we would call almost a progressive conservative. I hate to use that term, but that's kind of what you're getting. In other words, as we're going to see a little bit when we look at Edmund Burke, he's a conservative for slow change, uh, change that's rooted in tradition and authority, as we'll see from Edmund Burke. Um, he's going to be the early portion of the century. The latter portion of the century, the conservative kind of face will be that of the Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. And as Disraeli doesn't fit your idea of a conservative at all, he is not upper class. He is going to be Jewish by birth and converts to the Church of England, which is a really interesting kind of move. He is going to make his money and move up in politics. He is going to be about as conservative as they come, but he isn't going to come from money. He'll actually be a novelist at one point. And he makes his way up the ranks through political maneuverings and through various business enterprises. He's a self-made man, but he's going to be as aristocratic in taste and as conservative in taste as they come. So here's your conservatives, 3 different kinds of conservatives. Those who want slow change, those are even more progressive than that, but still want authority and an established church and these sorts of things. Those are the conservatives. On the other side of the political aisle, we're going to have the liberals. Now, liberalism in the 19th century does not mean what liberalism means now. Liberalism in the 19th century and in the 20th century, the 21st century are very different things. Conservatives in the 19th century don't quite match up with the conservatives now. There are differing branches of conservatism, as we'll see. Now, 2 of the great hallmarks of the liberals, particularly in Britain, are going to be these 2 gentlemen here. John Stuart Mill, who in the 1860s is going to give kind of voice to the quintessential statement of 19th century liberalism, and which you're going to be reading, some of you. And then William Gladstone, who is going to be Disraeli's opposite. They alternate who's in power in Britain. One liberal, one conservative, and they go back and forth. The liberals wanted small government. They wanted government to stay out of economic and social issues and leave a laissez-faire situation where, in fact, government operated and the economy operated according to natural laws, and they don't want the government interference in society. The conservatives, on the other hand, have no problem actually enacting legislation that regulates factories or any sort of those sorts of things. Now, while these 2 are going to be the dominant ideologies, and really conservatism is going to be more dominant than liberalism, there is going to be another group that's going to begin to appear, and that's the socialists. These 2 guys here, Louis Blanc and Robert Owen, will be early socialists in the 19th century. Owen's going to found several different ideal communities trying to create a social floor to try and achieve happiness collectively and without the emphasis on the individual that you get in liberalism. Louis Blanc is going to be French, and he's going to try some similar things. We also will see Marx's writings emerge in the middle of the 19th century, along with a number of other guys who, like Auguste Comte, who we won't get to deal with, and several others who will also be beginning to espouse very different philosophies. Now, in addition to the socialists, the communists, the liberals, the conservatives, we're also going to get one other group, the anarchists. Now, I've got a handout that's on Canvas about these guys. The anarchists believed that any government limits your freedom, and therefore all governments must be toppled. And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they're going to take to violent means to achieve this end. They're not really all that organized, kind of suitably given the term anarchist. They will, however, different groups of them manage to assassinate 12 different world leaders from about 1890 to 1910 and topple not a single government. They will bomb Wall Street around 1900. They will assassinate President McKinley, thereby putting Teddy Roosevelt into the office of the presidency. But they won't actually topple a government. Now, one of the isms that you probably don't expect in a political thought class is Romanticism. Romanticism represents a rebellion and is part of kind of creating the intellectual dichotomy of the West. The intellectual dichotomy means we pit head and heart against one another in a way that you don't find in every philosophical system. What you're hearing right now is Mozart. Mozart is a classical composer. He follows the rules. He is rational. He is reasonable. Like the emphasis in the arts and in everything in the Enlightenment. This kind of rational reasonableness is something that Camille Paglia actually says in her thesis on Western culture. She says that we have opposing pieces to us. Now, she calls them one, the Apollonian, or the followers of Apollos, and that Apollo is going to be the god of rational kinds of thought, whereas you have Dionysus, who's the god of emotion and madness and this kind of libertine kind of thing. And Paglia sees this back and forth between these two things as critical to the creation of Western culture. And if you look at it, you can see this between Enlightenment and Romanticism. The Enlightenment establishes rules for everything, rules for how a piece of music should sound. And when you listen to Mozart, there's nothing surprising. We'll go back and hear him for just a second again. Nothing surprising. It doesn't have particular variations in tone or speed. It's not surprising at all. Whereas Romanticism could shock the pants off of you. They're going to be all about emotion. So we get things like this is not how you're supposed to open a symphony. It's supposed to be quiet and gradual, not come in your face, scare you to death. But Beethoven really wasn't interested in following rules, like most of the Romantics. The Romantics, they're sometimes called the Transcendentalists on this side of the Atlantic. Guys like Emerson and Thoreau and even Hawthorne will fit into this movement. Now, before I get too deep into it, one of the questions that kind of bubbles up into this is where do Plato and Aristotle fit? To my own mind, Plato and Aristotle don't fit the kind of nice, clean neatness between emotion and reason. I think they're both trying to draw on reason, but you also see emotion filter in different portions of their work. Aristotle may be more towards the Enlightenment, but there are lots of parts about Plato who appeal to the Enlightenment. So you can see both of these guys showing up. And both of them kind of show up in pieces in the Romantics, but not completely. Let me show you what I mean. The Romantics are going to have a rebellion in the arts significantly. Painting, architecture, gardening, music, literature. We don't usually think of gardening as an art. The 18th century and the 19th century did. The Enlightenment gardens were regular and arithmetical, whereas 19th century gardens, they raised a mountain here, flattened a hill there to make it look what they wanted to. And it had to have this natural appeal. Capability Brown is one of the greatest of these. They didn't want deism. They didn't want rational deities. They want mysticism. They're going to believe in this Sturm und Drang, the storm and the doom kinds of ideas coming out of Germany. And this kind of Gothic sense is going to be very romantic. We get this kind of painting by John Martin, which is showing the wrath of God. It's the great day of his wrath. Now, this isn't, and you get all of the people being drug off into things. This is not rational. This is not the age of reason. This is not the age of Voltaire. They wanted spontaneity. They wanted natural expressions. They wanted movement. They wanted sensitivity and sensuality, and they wanted multiple themes. Their music had multiple themes running through it. There were solos. There were unexpected twists and turns, much like what you heard in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony a few minutes ago. They were interested in the common people, not heroic nobility and the classics. Medieval period, fine, okay, but not the classics. They wanted nationalistic kind of heroic history, but not heroes based on reason, heroes based on courage and heart. And they wanted nationalistic music and art. And so we hear this in lots of different places. Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, which I'm not playing today, fits right into this period. As do other pieces like Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. Is there a finer piece of Russian nationalism than a piece designed to embody the defeat of Napoleon, complete with cannons firing off at the end of it? But I'm not going to try and talk over that for the entirety of the video. We'll never get out. So how do these themes play out in politics, these ideas of the romantics? Well, there are a couple of places where we find it. One of the key pieces is in nationalism, this idea of nationalism that we're going to get into with the Germans. And we see nationalism breed rebellions in lots of different places in Europe throughout the 19th century. We see these young nation movements, young Italy, young Germany, young England, young France, young Sweden, all to promote nationalism from this youthful exuberance, okay? We also see it promote ideas like irredentism, because nationalism says these lands belong historically to these people. Well, what if those lands that you want belong to somebody else? Well, you begin to agitate for rebellion in those places and hopes that they will be able to join with you. The Italians and the Austrians are very, very good at this. But they're not the only ones. The Serbians are going to do this. And Serbian agitations about irredentism is actually going to lead into the First World War. We also see self-determination and the concept of the nation state very, very much tied to this concept of nationalism and the romantics and this idea of these cultural groups, this cultural nationalism that's part of the romantic movement. We also see some kind of the beginnings of environmentalism here because the Enlightenment believed nature could be controlled. And then the Romantics don't. They think nature is out of human control and shows how small humanity is. And so you get this kind of greater respect for nature and that nature should be left alone and nature can't really be controlled. Contrary to what the Industrial Revolution and, in fact, the Enlightenment think. In fact, the Romantics are very much reacting also against the Industrial Revolution as much as they are the Enlightenment. And their emphasis on the common people in art, and particularly in poetry, is going to feed into an emphasis on the common folk in politics. Emerson's discussion of civil disobedience on this side of the Atlantic is part of the Romantic movement. And that concept that an individual could have a role to play in politics, which also feeds into liberalism and its ideologies. Immanuel Kant and the Germans, who we'll talk about in a separate lecture, are all going to really be more romantics in their thought process and in where they fit into the overall cosmology than they are Enlightenment. And that's also going to breed support for democracy and popular participation in politics if you believe the common people are important and more important than, well, aristocratic noblemen, which is kind of that's redundant. But at any rate, we'll see a lot of emotions and political rhetoric and decision making. That's not necessarily new. We saw that with demagogues in ancient Greece and certainly even in Rome. Um, and that will bring kind of a dichotomy in politics, that we have these orators who speak with great emotion to stir the crowd, but we still want the common people to vote rationally. So we're playing off against one against another. Emotion over here, rationality over here, and we create this kind of line in between them. Once again, that idea of the dichotomy in Western thought that, in fact, Paglia likes to point out rather thoroughly. Now, Romanticism is more of a cultural movement, but the dominant ideology of the 19th century, and certainly by the end of the 19th century, is going to be conservatism. Conservatism, though, while liberalism is going to be beginning to grow, conservatism is going to actually pick a form. Now, you will still always have in any century, and even in the 21st century, you're going to have conservatives who will side with Metternich, who want to go back to the way things were before, and whatever the before is in question here, whether it's before the revolution, whether it's before this piece of legislation or this thing or whatever the event is. Okay. Then you have the conservatives who are for slow, measured change. Okay. Now, in the modern era, like 21st century, you also get a third group of conservatives that are also going to really be 19th century liberals who have become conservatives because they believe in small government. Whereas now, when we use the term liberal, which is a very relative term, liberal, what's your baseline? Okay, I have a good friend who likes to say that she was conservative when she lived in one area because she was married to a guy and she moved somewhere else, and she became a liberal because she doesn't believe all government involved in daily life is bad. These are relative terms, but we use them to designate a couple of different things. Okay, first, Metternich, the reactionary kind of conservative. Okay, and those on the other side of the political aisle from conservatives of any stripe usually like to accuse them of being reactionaries, that you want to just go backwards. Okay. But reactionaries is not what everybody is. Honestly, many of them are not. Reactionaries are only one piece of, in fact, the conservative landscape. The second piece of the conservative landscape are the guys who are represented by Burke that we're going to talk about in a minute. And the third piece are those who believe in small government, who in the 19th century and early 20th century are liberals because they believe in popular participation and more, and the government should get out of the reform business and simply deal with things like foreign policy and roads. Okay. Those are classical liberals who have become a version of conservative thought. Okay. So reactionaries, slow change, classical liberals all now get put into the conservative wing. And then liberals now are more what the socialists are in the 19th century. Okay. And we'll talk, and sometimes a combination of liberals and socialists is kind of how it works out together. Those two things kind of blend in different ways. Okay. That said, Edmund Burke is going to be usually referred to as the father of conservative thought. And Michael's going to talk a little bit more about this on Thursday. Edmund Burke was an Anglo-Irish statesman, politician. He serves in Parliament, and He is an incredibly effective speaker, as Michael and I were talking about recently. Michael reminded me how his foes didn't even want to debate him. He was so good. Um, this is Burke in a little bit earlier days. He was a fiery speaker. He's an interesting fellow because this father of conservatism is going to have different positions that he adopts based on what he sees are the principles at stake. Now, he's going to be a supporter of the American Revolution, but he's going to be a supporter of the American Revolution because he sees it rooted in what's going on in England. And because it's rooted in what's going on in England, he says these guys absolutely are entitled to their rights. They're heir to the same rights that we are in England, because after all, they're Englishmen. But because he's going to actually be heavily involved in government of the colonies. He's going to be a member of the Board of Trade. He's going to represent some of the colonies to the Board of Trade in London at different points, and he's going to be heavily involved. He's going to actually be serving in some of the cabinets of George III prior to the Revolution. But he supports the Americans. And I want to make certain we're clear about that. He thinks that the British should let the Americans go and then simply raise their taxes, which is what the British eventually do. And they make more money off of us as independent traders with Britain than they ever do with us as colonies. So when it comes time for the French Revolution, there are a number of folks who are very much gung-ho French Revolution. And one of them is going to be Richard Price, who knows Burke, is well acquainted with Burke, and he's a Whig minister. And the Whigs believed that liberty was progressing and everything in society was progressing towards greater liberty. And in November 1789, he gives this sermon, a discourse on the love of our country. And he drew lots of parallels between the Glorious Revolution and the French Revolution. And obviously, the French Revolution was going to be just as wonderful as the Glorious Revolution was in England. And this sermon, which is very, very typical, okay? This is typical. English political thought was expressed in Parliament, but it was also expressed from pulpits and in pamphlets. And it's going to ignite a pamphlet war between this group and these guys who agree with him and these guys who don't agree with him and these guys who don't agree with these guys and don't agree with these guys. And welcome to this. By the way, they loved this in the 19th century a lot. We're going to get a tract war over Oxford, and we're going to get tractarians and all kinds of things. Burke responds to Price. And a young friend of his who actually asked kind of what he thinks about what Price has to say with his own tract, which is quite frankly longer and more involved than many of the others there, because this is Burke and he's an orator in the 18th century and he's not in any hurry. And it's called A Reflection on the Revolution in France. And his reflection on the Revolution in France is really fascinating because here he is. He is, in fact, smelling out a rat in Price. There is Burke putting his nose and going, I don't think I smell a rat in your sermon. He's initially dismissed as pessimistic, okay? Partly because in 1790, when he writes this, everybody's really very much in favor of the French Revolution. Everybody sees the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen as a grand thing, lots in common with what's in the American Bill of Rights and the English Bill of Rights in 1689, a century earlier. So why wouldn't you be in favor of this? And certainly there are a lot of similarities. But Burke sees some serious problems. And Burke is going to be initially dismissed as pessimistic. Certainly by guys like the Marquis de Lafayette and others who are involved in the revolution. But he's actually going to be very prescient. He's going to be almost prophetic. But really he's not. He's simply looking backwards, and not to the Glorious Revolution, but all the way back to 1640. And what happens with Charles I and what happens with Cromwell. And he sees that as where the French are headed, into a time of, well, somewhat anarchy, but certainly a reign of terror. And he doesn't use that term, but he's going to talk about slaughters. And he's going to predict Napoleon. One of my favorite quotes from him is going to say, and there will come in that moment someone who possesses the true spirit of command, who will become master of your army. And in that moment, he will become master of your king, master of your assembly, and master of your whole republic. Now, he's using republic in the generic sense, but he's also going to argue that what they're doing by cutting loose all forms of authority is making it so that there's nobody to stop them, and they're not being slow and measured in their change. And he argues that rights are rooted in historic struggle. It's not just something you can assert that you have. He's going to deny the concept of arguing you have rights by asserting that you have them. Why do you have them? What did you do to get them? Thomas Paine, on the other hand, is going to argue directly against him and say, no, you have rights because we're born with them. Now, interesting, Paine is going to not really know where you get those rights from, because Paine's an atheist, one of the few in the 18th century. So what does Burke say? Well, first of all, he says there's no such thing as natural rights. He's going to disagree with this concept of natural right. He says rights are based on tradition and struggle. That's how you get them. So somebody at some point picked up a sword or a gun and fought to say, no, you can't do this. And therefore, you have that right. And he had lots of different examples. He could talk about Magna Carta. He could talk about the baronial revolt of the 1260s. He could talk about certainly the Civil War and the issues of the 1600s in England. And what he sees is that liberty is not something that you assert that you have, but liberty is an entailed inheritance. Now, let me explain what this means. This is not a phrase that we're going to understand. Entailed inheritance, you need to think Downton Abbey. It's very appropriate that I have Windsor Castle behind me. If you've seen Downton Abbey, if you've seen one of these things, if you're a Jane Austen fan, you'll get some of this, okay? Entailed inheritance is a concept in English property law. And it says that, okay, the Duke of Wellington does something fabulous. And at that point, he's not even Wellington. He's just this guy named Arthur Wellesley. But he defeats Napoleon. So, King gives him a dukedom. We'll give him a dukedom. Now, the dukedom actually comes, not just a title, there has to be a piece of property, at least in the 1800s, that goes with that, okay? And that's usually how aristocratic titles work, is that you have a piece of land that goes with the title, okay? Here we go. And we put those two pieces together, all right? Well, but that you can't just let that title go willy-nilly to anybody. No, the title is tied to the property, okay? And the property and the title together make an entailment. They are entailed and tied together as an inheritance. And so, okay, this generation fought, and for some reason, for services to the crown, was given this title in this land, okay? Well, then the next generation inherits it, but it's not really theirs. It's entailed to the title, and you have to pass it on intact to the next generation, because that's how this works. The land and the title go from one generation to the next. You're a caretaker. And liberty is that way for Burke. Burke thinks that liberty is not something that just belongs to us. He sees liberty as not just something that's individualistic. He sees it as something communal. But it's tied to what's happened in the past. And that now in the present, we are caretakers of that liberty. And we can add to it. Add more liberties to that, all we want. But We're not to alienate that liberty. We're not to sell it short or to get rid of it or to gamble it away. We have to pass it on intact to the next generation. And we hear even shades of this concept of entailed inheritance, even in our founding documents. Because we talk about in the preamble to the Constitution to ordain and establish for ourselves and our posterity, our inheritors, those who will come after us. And we establish these things that we might preserve the liberty that we have earned through the struggle, and for the struggle that these people who've died and given it to us, or that we survive because through the struggle, but we're establishing this so that we pass it on intact to the next generation. And the next generation passes it on to the next one. There's a reason why it's really fascinating to watch our presidents, that we go through the founding generation. And once we're done with the founding generation, we're like, who do we go to next? Jackson, who's got some link, but is really the next generation. And then after that, we go through Van Buren. And at the same time we're going through that, we've also got a new generation who is the inheritors. Guys like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster. He sees, to ensure that this liberty is passed on intact, you need both religious and political authority to maintain the boundaries of how liberty works, and so that no one uses their liberty in a harmful fashion, okay? Because he sees that as a danger. If you lack any kind of boundaries to mankind, he's a little closer to, he's got some Augustinian ideas in here about the nature of man. He doesn't believe that you can have moral absolutism devoid of faith. Paine does, because Paine has a lot of moral absolutes, but Paine has no faith. And he says no, because that's where the rights come from. They don't just happen up here in a cloud somewhere. You grab onto a cloud, you're going to get air and nothing else. Okay? And he says the trouble is, if you take out all forms of authority, what's going to happen in your society is that when one group is disaffected, they're going to turn to violence. And then there's nobody left to stop them and tell them no, that this is not okay, because you've taken out all the absolutes, you've taken out all the forms of authority. And so then everything comes to depend on violence in the army. And that's all that's left to maintain authority is force. Okay? And so it says that's when you're going to get the guy who's really good at military matters come into authority, because that's exactly what happens to Cromwell. And that's what's going to be Napoleon. Nobody's heard of Napoleon. And those in the 19th century think he's a prophet because he predicts the reign of terror, and he depicts Napoleon before anybody's ever heard of them. There are other conservatives in the 19th century who will come at this from a different angle. And will have differing ideas that will add to some of what the things we see from Burke, and also will go in new directions. One of these guys is Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle is an interesting fellow to have as a conservative thinker. He's a literary critic who's also a literary theorist. He doesn't just criticize literature, he writes these long philosophical treatises, most notably on heroes and hero worship. And he argues that this business of liberal laissez-faire and individualism was undermining society. And there is certainly something in this, that in order for society to work, you have to balance the needs of the individual against the needs of the many. And I start to sound like Star Trek, of the needs of the many and the needs of the one, few or the one. Okay, and you have to balance the two of them. And it's a really good thing to reference Star Trek in this instance, because at different points in the original films, you have the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the one or the few. And then there are other times when the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. Okay, and that's something that Carlyle's really sensitive to. He says you need heroes, And you need these figures who are going to go strive for the best in society. He's really fascinating though because he rejects faith, even though he thinks you need to be for the good of the community. Um, he rejects democracy. Now, understand, uh, not some sort of popular participation in government, but he doesn't want full suffrage for everybody. He's not there. He doesn't agree with that. And he thinks that's a dangerous way to you don't create a society where everyone's getting things fair because everybody's just all about themselves. He's going to praise the Germans for their cultural achievements. He thinks you need strong, heroic leaders to govern the masses, this hero who will draw them to them. And he really wants this kind of meritorious, heroic aristocracy more than anything else. And then you get guys like Benjamin Disraeli. Now, this is another, I showed you him when he's younger. This is when he's older. And I mentioned that he's a novelist as well as a politician. And it's in his novels that he, as well as in his speeches in Parliament, that he really talks about these conservative ideas. He is a practical politician. He's not a conservative because he wants to go backwards. He's a conservative because he sees it as practical. Okay. So Carlyle is on that border of almost being a reactionary. Disraeli, on the other hand, is more towards Burke and slow change. He writes a series of novels, Coningsby, Sybil, and then he's also going to have a great speech that he gives at the Crystal Palace, which is the very first World's Fair that's done in 1851. And he gives this rousing speech to a crowd there at the same spot in 1872. It's going to be a very pro-empire and very well received by the public. But at the same time, he's a guy who's very sensitive to the needs of the whole community. Okay. So here he is, a conservative, but he's not a reactionary, because what he's going to do in Coningsby and Sybil is to demonstrate the problems in British society. He sees there are two nations, and he talks about this in his novels. He talks about this in his speeches. You have a nation of wealth and you have a nation of poverty. We have these two nations that are operating simultaneously and often against one another. And he sees a need to find a way to bridge the gap through industrial reform, and other sorts of reform legislation. And he supports an aristocratic constitution. Okay, so he doesn't want universal male suffrage, the universal female suffrage, period. He's not for that. He wants one that gives more power to those who have wealth, because he thinks you need their input in order for the society to work. You need their money. You need their buy-in to support things, because the poor don't have it. You need you need the upper classes to pay the taxes. And he supports the monarchy. He supports the union of Britain, of England and Scotland and Ireland, because this is the 19th century, and Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And he supports the concept of empire because he thinks it's good for the nation. Now, Benjamin Disraeli has a large following, not just amidst the aristocracy. The working classes in Britain in the 19th century are largely conservative. Those who are of the lower classes who do have the vote, and there are some, vote overwhelmingly conservative. They don't vote liberal. That's a middle class method. And they don't vote socialist. They vote conservatives, because the conservatives are the one who passed reform for them. Then you get guys like Joseph de Maistre. He is from the Savoyards. The Savoyards family is eventually the Savoyards. This is the Kingdom of Savoy, which eventually will become the Kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont, and will become one of the two instrumental kingdoms with the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and the unification of Italy. And the House of Savoy will eventually become the ruling family of a united Italy. Okay, just kind of give you an idea. These guys are in the southern portion. If you can imagine the Italian boot, and I didn't bring my map here, and you've got this lip up here that's around the mountains. The Savoy is right in here, and they're really kind of critical in the 18th and 19th centuries. There's a lot of alliances that they're part of. Um, uh, and Joseph de Maistre, here you see, is going to be very much a liberal in a lot of ways. He's going to side with the Jacobins in the French Revolution, and he's going to get exiled for some of his ideas. Eventually, he starts writing several things. They're going to be influential in what happens in the unification movement in Italy. He writes about the Pope. He writes on the Gallican Church, which is the French church. He writes about his experiences in St. Petersburg because he's a guy on the move. But he starts out as a Jacobin in the Revolution. These radicals who want universal male suffrage. But he decides that this is not actually creating stability for France. And he's going to be one of those who theorizes why you need to put the Bourbons back on the throne in 1815. You need to create stability and legitimacy, and this will allow you to prosper. And you can create more of a popular input into government once you have stability, okay? He thinks the philosophes were dangerous because they didn't want to deal with practical realities. They just simply wanted to deal with these high and lofty ideas. He wanted to reach for this cloud, according to Burke. And they come away with air and destruction. He believes Burke was right. And so he thinks you need to purge these guys and then reconstruct society. And you need the church, and you need the monarchy, and you need the aristocracy for discipline, for boundaries of where you can go. Because the conservatives are really not optimistic about human nature at all. They see this as very much something where humanity needs to be governed. They're going to agree with Augustine, the government's a necessary evil. He thinks that absolutism is better, though. He doesn't really want a British system of constitutional monarchy. He just wants it with some boundaries on the monarch so that you don't get tyranny. He sees the republics as a road to anarchy, and he thinks written constitutions are artificial. He's not got no patience with the social contract. And he sees history and custom as the basis of government. So he's got some common with Burke, but Burke actually doesn't think written constitutions are bad. He thinks you need them to limit tyranny. And that's something you win through struggle. And they're not artificial. They're born of struggle. Okay. So you're going to get a lot of different ideas, even on the conservative spectrum, and you can start to see them. Now, between the conservatives and the liberals, you also get some other isms and other ideas floating around that sort of fit with the liberals and sort of fit with the conservatives, and sometimes they don't fit really well with either one of them. And one of those is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a really interesting idea. We might call it realpolitik, but it's more specific than that. And it's going to be the brainchild of two particular individuals. One is Jeremy Bentham, and the other is James Mill. Now, James Mill, some of you are going to be reading the writings of his son, John Stuart Mill. But Bentham and Mill do what they call the greatest happiness of the greatest number, okay? And what they mean by that is that they believe that governments and society should be run on the principle of utility. Is it useful? Okay. If it's not useful, it's not going to be great happiness to the greatest number, then we don't need it. Okay. They have no use for tradition or sentiment or the arts. Nope. You don't need them. They're not useful. They're not necessary to run the society. Okay. Now, those of us who are locked in quarantine at the moment are going to argue that the arts are rather important because they're helping us keep our sanity. Okay. They don't think so. They don't think you need emotion. Now, notice these guys are going to be operating in the 18th century, and they are products of the Enlightenment, and they don't go off into the Romantic movement. They disagree with the Romantic movement. You need this art. You don't even need Enlightenment art. Okay. You just need utility. What's the greatest usefulness? They have what they call philosophic calculus, a mathematical formula to determine social welfare based on the sum total of individual happiness. It's the science of welfare to figure out what policies you need. It's very mathematical. We can do this. Okay. And they're going to agree, they're going to argue that liberty isn't coming from natural rights either. It's also not absolute, but on exact circumstances, and it's embodied in legislation. It's legislation that determines your liberty. And in some ways, they're almost Hobbesian, that liberty is granted to you by the government, not through struggle, but by whatever circumstances your government has and what you've been granted, and through legislation. That's what your rights are. We're not real happy with that idea, because then that means that the government can at some point limit your rights, and that makes us very uncomfortable. They believe that you should judge and act by its consequences, not by its principle. They don't think principles are all that significant. You just need to decide what's how this worked out and what the ramifications were of a policy, and that's how you decide whether or not it's actually effective. So, not whether or not it was the correct method, but just its consequences. Now, this is something that we actually see in modern politics. This is an idea that you'll see that, okay, well, this achieved what I wanted, and even though it didn't follow in principle, it's okay. And you hear that in a lot of different places in national politics. Now, they are an interesting bunch, though, because they have some really weird ideas. This is Jeremy Bentham. This is not a statue of him. This is him. Jeremy Bentham puts in his will, he's actually going to be one of the founding members of University of London. And he has his body preserved and put into a glass case. Now, the hands and the face are reconstructed wax put onto his bones and skull, okay? He's preserved in glass. He is perpetually a member of the board of trustees for the University of London. His glass case sits above the main entryway into the university. At Board of Trustees meetings, he is wheeled into the room. He does not vote, but they refer to him occasionally. I don't know how useful this is and how you would judge this against the principle of utility, but it's in his will and in the endowment of the university, so they're stuck with it. Isn't this fun? So what do they propose, these guys? Well, no, they don't want an aristocracy. They don't want common law, just legislation. So the glory of English government, they're getting rid of. They don't want the monarchy. They don't want bicameral legislature. You don't need checks and balances. You just need one group. That's it. They are very much involved in creation of the Great Reform Bill of 1832, which increases the amount of people who have the franchise, the right to vote in England, and rearranges redistricts England for the first time since the 1400s, and some things of this nature. They lose a lot of steam. You will see some of their ideas about utilitarianism and the sanitary reforms based on some of the work of Edwin Chadwick in his report in 1840. Carlyle has tremendous fun with them. He thinks they're ridiculous. Okay, and Bentham's, will and what happens to his body doesn't help matters. It also doesn't help their cause that their concepts about utility are going to lead to a nervous breakdown in James Mill's son, John Stuart. John Stuart Mill is going to be a child prodigy. Like many in the early 19th century, there's a lot of child prodigies with this emphasis on education. John Stuart Mill's brilliant. But his father believes that he should not know anything but mathematics. That's all he needs. practical stuff like mathematics and science. And so John Stuart Mill sets himself the mathematical problem of figuring out how many different combinations of notes there are. Now, if you're at all musically inclined, that you know that there is an infinite number of combinations of those 8 notes in the scale. And it makes him wind up in a nut house. And what saves him is the lady who becomes his wife, Harriet, and poetry. He begins to teach himself that there is more to life than just what is deemed useful by this mathematical calculus, and that mathematical calculus cannot really understand all there is to know. This is one of the things that Dr. Brazil talks about, is that while quantitative study is really cool, there are a lot of things that can't be effectively described by quantitative methods. Don't tell the utilitarians. Now, you probably don't want to tell these guys either that you need something other than mathematics. And this is the political economists. Now, the beginnings of political economy also come in this transition from the 18th into the 19th centuries, and we see this really begin to gain. Now, classical economics usually comes under the umbrella of liberalism, and most of these guys are going to be very much in line with the liberal thinking of John Stuart Mill. They're going to believe in laissez-faire government, and that the government shouldn't get involved in the economy in particular. And that way, you should also have limited government. They're going to build their theories on Adam Smith and to a degree on the physiocrats, although they were going to largely reject them. And we'll come back to Adam Smith a little bit later on. Now, one of the things that we see in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that's published in 1776, is the concept of the invisible hand of the market, that market forces would drive prices up and down and regulate things based on supply and demand. That's what we mean by the free market system, is that the market will take care of adjusting things, because eventually you reach a point where nobody will pay that much. Okay, I went to shop for milk today, and Walmart was out, and the only milk they had left was going to charge me $7 a gallon. Not going to do that. I'm going to go shop somewhere else. Sure enough, found a gallon of milk for about $3 or $4. Now, that's a big difference, right? Supply can drive, the lack of supply and a great demand can drive up your price, but you eventually will hit a wall where people won't necessarily pay that. I'll find another way. I'll do something different, because that's not worth it to me. And he says that's part of the free market. And he says it in a lot more frou-frou language than I do. Carlyle and Thomas Coleridge will both dislike political economy. Of course, Carlyle dislikes it. He likes heroes. This is not heroic. Coleridge hates it too, but Coleridge is also one of these guys who's a romantic and likes heroes. And instead, he calls it the dismal science. These classical economists, about political economy, are going to argue against mercantilist ideals. And we'll talk more about those when we look at imperialism. The concept of mercantilism was that the mother country got all the benefits out of this colonial relationship. And you had to have high tariffs and not free trade, because if you had free trade, that would decrease the amount of your profits. The classical economists of this period will also reject socialism as unjust, because you're using unequal talents and you're forcing sharing of rewards is disastrous, because you take away all of the motivation for those people to work harder or work smarter and to achieve. And the forced sharing takes away this guy who's earned this and gives it to somebody who hasn't. And that's unjust. Now, we can go into theories of inherited wealth too if you want, but somebody aren't. But that also has to be maintained. Okay. Now, the classical economists will be guys like Jean Baptiste Say. Say's law of markets will argue that how much production and you have in the aggregate will create an equal amount of demand. Now, that's not always the same thing, but that's going to be his law. He says there can't be a general glut of the market because the demand will just shift to another thing. So it's all of the production, not just of a specific thing, but of the entirety of the market. He says any kind of in savings is an investment in the future. And so he's going to talk a lot about this law of markets and how the markets adjust. So you got a lot of people doing economic theory, and I'm not going to go much deeper than that into the economic theory. But I do want to talk about two other guys who are really critical to this discussion of political economy, and that is the guys who talk about population. And the most important of these two is the first one, although the other is going to be very important as well, as we'll see. And that's Thomas Malthus. Now, I'm not going to try to steal too much of Olivia's thunder because Olivia is going to talk about Malthus some on Thursday. But Thomas Malthus, in the middle of the French Revolution, pens this work called the Essay on the Principle of Population. Now, like a lot of essays, he's responding to somebody else, and he's going to be disagreeing with them. And this is a lot of what you see in the 18th century and in the 19th century, this back and forth on theories. He argues that the population, unchecked, does not increase quite the way that everybody thinks it does. Now, the idea of the question about how the population grows and why it grows is a real serious question in the 18th century because for the first time, they're seeing the population almost double inside of 150 years. And nobody's ever seen this kind of population growth. Now, a lot of this has to do with what's going on in the agricultural revolution and better medical care. Better food supply, better medical care, you get in a population increase. So, quite frankly, Malthus says, well, if you don't check the population, it's just going to keep growing. And it's going to be growing at a rate that kind of mirrors some of the scarier charts that we've seen with COVID-19, those scarier but without the drop-off that just keeps going. And that's what he's going to say. He says the problem is that while the population is going to be increasing at exponential rate, the food supply can only increase arithmetically. Okay. So it's basically this. Food supply can only go 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. Okay. Whereas when you get in the geometrical kind of thing, and please do not take my mathematical terms at face value because I'm never good at this business geometrical, but you start to see this, you get 2 times 2 is 4. Well, then you make 4 times 4 is 8, and then 8 times 8 is 64. And if it starts, when you start doubling, it starts going fast pretty quick, but it goes even faster than that. Okay. Because it's not just going to be a number squared. It's going to be even faster. And he says that's the problem. The population is going to outpace the food supply. So this is what he calls the Malthusian trap. He says that, okay, here's your time, and here's the amount of food you need. And this is the amount of food produced. And eventually you're going to need more food than you can actually produce. Now, we're going to do a lot of things in terms of food production to try and increase that. And a lot of that's going to come in terms of industry. And he says that's one method of dealing with this. But he's also going to be concerned that this is a difficult problem. And he doesn't think that you can solve it by just solving the food supply. He says you're always going to have a greater increase of population than you are of, in fact, food. It's just the law of how it works. So he says you're going to need to impose some controls on population. Now, Olivia is going to talk to you about what kinds of these are, but in general, he's not talking about government imposing limits on families. He's talking about kind of societal changes as part of that. He's going to argue for the corn laws and against poor relief because that's going to help control the population. But at the same time, he also sees other things as necessary for the moral high ground. Now, if you heard some things in there that sounded like Darwin's struggle for survival, well, Malthus is critical. You can't get to Darwin without Malthus. It just doesn't work. Now, Malthus is almost always discussed along with David Ricardo. Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy is about 2 decades later than Malthus's essay on population. And this is really the beginnings of political economy. The others are kind of precursors. But you need both of these pillars for discussions of modern day questions about politics and populations and economies. You need both of these guys. And it's really the political pinnacle of political, or the early business of political economy. He argues for the theory of comparative advantage. And what he means by this is that you need each economy to specialize in something specific. And when you do that, then you are going to have an advantage in the international markets, and you're just going to be able to produce more and do more. He begins to use this concept of the iron law of wages, much like what I was talking about a little bit a minute ago, about that wages are going to tend towards the lowest possible. Okay. But nobody wants to pay their workers more than they have to, because it's the single greatest cost that they've got. Okay. You pay your workers what you think is necessary. Now, what do you think is necessary? Is it necessary that you pay them a pittance, or is it necessary that you pay them well and with good benefits in order to keep good employees? Those are lots of factors involved. And what is the lowest possible? Okay, not the highest possible, but the lowest possible. And the lowest that's an advantage. He also begins to discuss what we call the labor theory of value. Now, the labor theory of value, which is always kind of a concept on the move here, he says that if wages and profit are the same, then production capital is always made up of wages. In other words, that the value of anything produced is always about the labor, okay? If wages and profit are the same, then the production is coming out of the wages only. The value of the productions is based on whatever it takes to make them. If I have a pen, it's not the materials in it, okay, that make up how much this is going to cost me, okay? This pen is not made up of things that it costs very much. What costs are the wages, okay? So production capital, what you need to produce something, is about how much you need to pay in terms of wages. And that's why we see the value, this labor theory of value, which Marx is going to pick up on, okay? Now, he also gets into the discussion about rent, of how does rent figure into labor theories of value. He thinks that there's this question about whether or not rent is surplus value on the land. It's privately owned, but then you're renting it out. And are you creating extra value on the land that doesn't actually belong to it? Malthus says rent is a prime source of savings and investment. He thinks that's a key thing that's very important. Ricardo has mixed emotions on this one, and some people interpret him as that he thinks that rent is surplus value, and you'll have other schools of thought who think he agrees with what Malthus. But what you get out of all of this with Ricardo and Malthus is that economics and policies were measurable. That's what you're getting coming out of even the utilitarians, is that we can use mathematics to try and do this. And this is still what political scientists do, is to figure out whether or not this is working. We want data. Well, I'm going to leave the conservatives and the political economists there. And we're going to head into another field and talk about the great woman question and one of our other videos for this week. And then we'll head towards the Germans. We've got Germans and their ideas and imperialism and the early portions of feminism to talk about in the upcoming lectures. And I will see you next time.